Thank you very much. It's a wonderful privilege for Gail and me to be with you all in your beautiful country. We've had a great week. That's why we're awake this morning. Flew in here, I think, a week ago today, and spent the first 24 hours without luggage because the airlines back in the United States made a few mistakes, and we found our luggage in Mongolia, I think it was. And so for the first 2 or 3 days, I remember the people here are very frank. I was talking to the baggage handler at the airport in Auckland, and he said, well, none of us want to get downwind to you, which I thought was quite a frank comment. But a week is a good enough time to get some impressions of a country when you've never been here for the first before. You're trying to gather those first visceral, intuitive impressions of what's unique about a country. I love your trees. I have never seen so many straight trees in all my life. I have yet to see a crooked tree in New Zealand. I think all of them must be in a computer someplace, government managed, and it's just amazing. Then I love your hot showers. We have had wonderful hot showers this week. It just seems like every place we've been, it's been just wonderful to stand under the hot water that comes down on you. And I don't know where all the water comes from, but you seem to have an abundance of it. The rotaries leave a little bit to be desired, especially when you've spent your life driving on the other side of the road. And our friend Alan has no understanding of how close he came to getting a piece of junk back after about my 5th time in a rotary, where you get totally disoriented if people drive on the other, I was going to say the wrong side of the road, but that wouldn't be a popular statement. Then I've been very impressed with the mercilessness of the All Blacks. Got to watch a few snippets of the game with Wales, and I'm very impressed. It's been a great experience, and I hope we can learn more as time goes by. Let me get started by saying I have an objective for the day, and I'm going to punch it up right away and see if I can set the stage for what these next hours may be like that you've been so good to invest yourself in. My prayer, Gail's prayer, is that we can make it worth your while for being here today. If I were to put an objective for the day into writing, it would go like this. I would like for us to put our normal responsibilities of serving others on hold for a few hours, like turning off cell phones. To put the responsibilities for serving others on hold for a few hours so that we can turn our attention to the state of our own personal lives and engage with this question. What ideas and processes are essential if a leader is to thrive personally in the face of public pressures? You probably would not be in this room today if you were not what I call a public person. You've been called, you're paid, you're set apart to do most of your work in public with other people. Your effectiveness depends upon your ability to create an environment of influence in which people's lives are changed. Conversion to Christ, growth in Christ-likeness, effectiveness in spiritual service. It's all public stuff. And the question comes, in the face of public life and ministry, how are you doing? Where do you get your energy from? How do you renew yourself? I'm not just talking about the issue of the regathering of physical strength when one is tired, for example, after a long Sunday or whenever your peak workday is in the week. But how do you renew yourself mentally and emotionally? Where do you get your new ideas from? How do you stop from just recycling old thought again and again and again? How do you keep yourself psychically strong when often there is resistance, when there are people who are openly critical of things that you are and things you do? Maybe the most important question would be, how do you renew your soul? Enlarge the heart so that it becomes a fit dwelling place for the Lord God about whom we've been singing in the last minutes. If there are any other questions that I could scatter out, it might be, how do you keep renewed in your relationships? Most of us in this room are probably married. Public life takes a real take on marriage. It erodes it. It corrodes the sinews that bring people together. So also the family. It's very difficult to maintain close personal relationships when you're a public person. How do we do that? So all of those things are part and parcel of the inner circle of the public person's life. My observation over the last number of years, I've been in the pastoral ministry now for about 45 years. My observation, let's say, of the last 15 years is that the overwhelming amount of material that has been offered to people like you and me in public life is almost all about vision, about leadership, about team building, about programs of one type or another, how to grow these large, humongous megachurches, which is the new operative word in our generation, how to do all that stuff. And every once in a while, somebody's successful at doing it. And a lot of other people feeling a little bit left behind say, why him or her and not me? So we're getting a lot of books and a lot of seminars and a lot of conferences and a lot of very powerful people who speak on television and in circumstances like this who are telling us the 10 easy steps, the 15 different ways, the 27 different steps to this, that, and the other thing. But how often do leaders just stop and say, what about me? How am I doing? And how am I going to live a sustainable life as a leader that will carry me over 45 or 55 years? Those of you under the age of 38, I've got good news for you. You're just warming up. Conceivably, if God has anything to do with it, your greatest ministry, your greatest effectiveness as a person will not come until you're in your 50s, 60s, and 70s. So the first 20, 25 years of ministry are really just warm-ups compared to what's possible down the line if we learn to be sustainable in our lives, if we learn to keep on growing on the edge, if we learn how to stay secure yet changing all the time, then we become more effective in the second half of life as we put together the experiences of the past, we begin to minimize the errors in judgment we once made, maximize those strengths which we have, and we are able then to cast a larger net of ministry in the second half of life. But may I say rather sadly, I see relatively few in number who are able to do that. So what you get in the 5th year of ministry and in about the 15th year of ministry is an enormous percentage of people who finally just drop away and surrender to other kinds of lives and choices because they've not been able to sustain the growth track of themselves as public people in life. So that's why the objective you see on the screen. It is there, isn't it? Yeah. That's the objective for the day. And I want to engage in what I hope will be an ongoing conversation with you. And when the break time comes, we'll break no matter where we are and just pick it up at the next point, because it's very hard for me to divide this talk into 4 easy segments. It's got several different divisions, but over the day I hope there'll be this ongoing conversation which speaks to the paragraph behind me on the screen. But before I go any further, I want to get to know you a little bit better, and it's rather difficult to do that when you have this many people in a room, but maybe I could try by simply saying, would you help me with 2 or 3 impressions? I'd like for you to answer this question in just one word. And a number of you can shout it out. Well, don't shout, I'll get scared. But give me some ideas. If I were to ask you the question, give me a word which describes a significant dimension of New Zealand culture. I'm here for the first time. I want to get to know what New Zealanders are like. What words would you use to describe the New Zealand, I'm going to make that mistake several times today, the New Zealand culture? What kind of people are you? Give me a word. Somebody? Sport. Okay, you're sports driven. I'm sorry? Rugby. Okay. Laid back. That's interesting. Okay. Innovative. Okay. I heard a female voice. Individualistic? Boy, I thought we were individual. Okay, great. Somebody back there? I thought I heard a word back there. Entertainment? Independent, okay. Very social, okay. Yeah, I found that in the Rotaries, okay. Cynical. Interesting. Anything goes. Give it a go, huh? Okay. That's really true in your churches, huh? Give it a go, make changes anytime you want, sing new songs, nobody minds, bring drums into the sanctuary. Is that what you meant? I was just wondering. Okay. I want to hear a few more. Godless? Okay. So it's a very secular culture. Okay. Anybody got any more for me? Okay. What does he mean? It's a Maori word. But what does it mean? Challenge. Okay. Okay. Oh, you mean when they do the dance or whatever? Okay. I wonder what that was about. I thought it was a charismatic worship. Challenge. Okay. Indigenous and multicultural. I love those words. Okay? A small nation complex. Yeah, you have to fly about 10 hours to get anywhere, don't you? Okay? That's an interesting thought. Let me ask you a second question. Now give me a set of words that describe what you think is the culture of the Christian movement in New Zealand. And go across the spectrum for me. Tell me what you think is the sense of mood, of morale, of direction of the Christian movement in New Zealand. Notice I said movement and not just church. Waking up, okay. Small. Changing, okay. Conservative. Okay. Adaptable. Interesting to hear two words, conservative and changing, come right next to each other. Searching. Okay. Timid. Okay. And does timid mean the same as intimidated? Be a link, okay? Apathetic. Have you heard these words? Aren't they interesting how they cross the spectrum? Some words very aggressive, some and positive, others suggesting struggle. That leads me to a third and last question. I know you didn't come here for me to ask you questions, but you're helping me now. Now describe to me in one-word shots what you think is the overall morale of Christian leaders. That's you in New Zealand today. Where do you think Christian leadership is today? Give me some words for that. Tired? Struggling? Confused? Excited? Okay. 1 for 4. Rising? I didn't get that one. Determined. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sometimes the E's and I's in New Zealand get mixed up for me. Are you quiet because you're deeply thinking about this and never thought about it before, or what? Frustrated? I'm sorry? Inadequate? Overloaded. Interesting bundles of words, aren't they? They tell me more about you than I knew 15 minutes ago, but very, very helpful to me. And hopefully I can somehow say a few things that the Holy Spirit could use to speak into them today. None of the words are strange to me. I feel like as a pastor I've lived through them all and understand them in some way as we would use them as a group of public people. So let's use that as a little seedbed for a conversation. Gail and I have come to the conclusion in the last few years, and you may say, duh, why did it take you so long to get there, that you really, really don't know people unless you know their story, which is an interesting thought, the story of a person. If any of us are 40, 50 years of age, we have long stories that are exponentially much longer than anybody half our age. We've accumulated layer upon layer of experience, of insight, of relationship, of accomplishment, of failure, of wounds, of sadnesses and ecstasies. And they all blend together like a big stew and become our story. What I've come to understand about a fault of ministry that I've helped create over the years as a pastor is there are very few places in a church where we are able to tell each other our stories. And to the extent that all we do is we seat ourselves in, for example, pews like we have right here, where you're all seated facing me and now you're kindly, courteously listening to me, to that extent, we make it almost impossible in a church to know each other's stories. And when we don't know each other's stories, we really don't understand how the power of gospel works or isn't working for people. For it's only in the stories that we fully begin to understand how Jesus makes a difference in each of us as we commit to following him. For example, you know almost next to nothing about me. You know nothing about my story, other than if you one day somewhere in the past read one of my books, you will know that I have a habit in most of my books of telling little stories about myself or about Gail and me, because I've discovered that most of anything I have to say really comes out of a story. But if a person hasn't read any of the stuff that I've written, they're not going to know anything about me. You're looking at me and all you're seeing is another guy who's kind of an old guy. He's probably older than most of the people in this room, and I'm probably old enough to be the father of more than a few of you today. I'm getting depressed. But you notice that my hair has gotten gray, that some of it's falling away. You probably made your own judgment now about how you interpret me by the clothing I'm wearing and the sound of my voice, and you're saying to yourself, oh, he's so casual up there, something like that. That's your impression. But you don't know my story. Until you know my story, you're not going to know me, and you're really not going to know whether any of the things I say today are worth hearing. If I were to tell you my story, the temptation would be, because I'm a man, and I'm like lots of other human beings, the temptation would be to tell you about all the good things that have happened to me, all the places where I have enjoyed a little tidbit of success. I might want to tell you about the churches that I've been a pastor at, because most of you are in Christian ministry, so that's one of the ways we evaluate each other. I might want to tell you about the size of those churches and the complexities of the programs and the team here and there that I may have been a part of. That would be the temptation, to want to try to impress you with the things which have happened to me that have been successful. But if I told you about my successes, you still wouldn't know me very well. Because there is a sense, if you think about it, we really don't know each other very well when all we talk about is our successes. Now, I don't know about women, but when men get together, there's a temptation, if we're just getting to know each other, to make all of our conversations about successes. The things we've achieved in sports, the things we've done in business, the kind of car we drive, the places we've been, the people we know, all these kind of things that elevate self-worth. But When that's all over, we've done nothing really to bring ourselves together. We've done more or less things which divide us. So a good story really has to include struggle in it. And when I tell my story about leadership and ministry, what I've discovered over the years is that I connect best with people when I salt my story with struggle, when I tell people where I've been, where there were tears, and where there was defeat, and where there was real discouragement. Then I begin to connect with people. If I were to tell my story of ministry, for example, I would start the story by telling you back when I was 23 years of age and Gail and I had met. We were introduced by a common friend. We were engaged in 3 weeks and married in 4 months. Largely because, people that we trusted really felt that we would be good for each other, and it didn't take long for us to agree and to discover that both of us, independently of the other, we'll talk more about this tomorrow, had sensed a call from God, and there was just a natural merger of calls, a collusion of personalities. So many things happened almost instantly that made us fall deeply in love and to enjoy the company of each other without reservation. And the day we got off our honeymoon, we went directly into ministry. I had the opportunity at the age of 23 to join a church staff as a youth pastor. See, back in the 1940s and 50s, churches had youth leaders and youth directors. But around 1960, we started to get youth pastors. These were people who were actually paid to keep kids off the streets, which is really what it amounted to in those days. And so we get married, we take this little inexpensive honeymoon, and I join this church staff as a youth pastor. And for about 12 months, everything goes great. The people loved Gail, and they liked me. We were the vivacious young couple with all the romance and all the sentiment and all the enthusiasm, and the kids in this youth ministry gathered around us, and it just seemed like week after week, things went wonderful, which is what often happens when a person starts in the youth ministry in the first months. But somewhere around the 12th or 13th month, it all went south. I'm not talking about the South Island, but in America we say it goes south, which means it went bad. And suddenly, for reasons that I never fully understood, the same people who thought that I was wonderful stopped thinking that. Suddenly it seemed as if I couldn't make a good decision at all. Suddenly it seemed as if all the programs that I had instigated and innovated weren't working at all. It seemed like the morale just dropped out the bottom. Now, that was my perception. Others may have thought differently, but for the first time in my life, I really began to perceive of myself as a total failure. Now, you must understand the difficulty of that moment for me was that I had been raised to be a pastor. When my mother and my father brought me home from the hospital on that first week of birth, the family story is that my mother and my grandmother joined their hands over my cradle and they committed me to God, and my grandmother said to my mother, "Now you have your preacher, raise him to be one." And from the earliest days, that was all I heard, was the great joy of being a preacher of the Bible. And it was very clear that I would make my mother very, very happy if I preached the Bible for the rest of my life. And so I grew up with this sense of a destiny that someday God was going to use me to preach the Bible, and I was maybe going to win the world for Christ or something like that. So if you understand that all of my life I had been raised to go into ministry, and at the end of the first 12 months of ministry, I see myself already to be a total failure, you can understand the significance of what that moment's like for me. Now I'm 24, and I'm already not making it. The coup de grace, as they say, came one day when I was walking through one of the rooms of our church, and I saw a piece of crumpled up paper underneath one of the seats. And why I did this, I don't know, but I picked it up and I smoothed it out. And there was a note that some person had written to another person. And the note said, "If MacDonald doesn't get out of here soon, this whole ministry is going to go down the toilet." I was crushed beyond words. The hurt of reading those words and realizing that someone thought this of me was more than I could bear. I was really too young to be handling things like that. I didn't have the ability to handle criticism. I took it too personally. And I assumed that whoever wrote this note was speaking for everybody. And I went into my little study and I put a piece of paper into my typewriter and I wrote out my resignation, and before the afternoon was over, I had it on the desk of the senior pastor. And within a week or two or three, I forget how long now, we were gone. Gail was in the process of bearing our first child in the next months, and so I had to go to work in a trucking company to make the living for our family. And here I was at 24 years of age, and all I had tasted was failure, and I had quit. And that's the operational word I want you to hear at the beginning of my story, is that I started ministry as a quitter. Many, many years later, when my mother died, I had to call a distant relative. I didn't know my mother's family well, but I had to call this distant relative to inform her of my mother's death. And when I said to her, "My mother has died," her first statement was, "Well, I'm not surprised. The whole family was a bunch of quitters." What on earth does that mean? You know, and for the first time I heard my mother's story, which she had never told me. That my mother had been of a family of Swedish immigrants, 8 brothers and sisters, and there'd been a disposition in the whole family line that the minute life got tough, the men drank themselves to death and the women just got sick, and they died. And in that statement, I began to realize, many, many years later, that in a strange way I had inherited what might be called the quitter's gene. A tendency that the minute things go rough, the first reaction is to cut and run, I have a fear that I would have spent my whole life running from defeats and failures and criticism and opposition, probably if I'd not married Gail, who was one of those great influences early in my years to begin to help me to see this in a different way. But I'd come from a family line of quitters. And here I was 12 months into ministry, and I'd already quit. That was the first significant lesson I had to learn in ministry, is that when the tough times come, you don't quit. And God allowed me in that first year to learn one of the most important character lessons of my life. You don't quit when times get tough. A few years later, as I did resume life in public ministry, I had an opportunity to become a part of a young team of men who had a very innovative approach in those days. It wouldn't be today, but then it was, to evangelism. And I caught on with this team and had an opportunity to travel back and forth across the U.S. and speak in different places on behalf of evangelism. And it was a very interesting ministry, and I learned a lot very, very quickly. But there arose a problem in the team that I would never have foreseen, because I began to get, as we say, crossways in the chute, in conflict with one of those team members. And as the weeks and a few months went by, I began to realize I could not resolve this conflict in any way, shape, or form. And what grew in my heart was something I'd never known before, and it was can I be blunt with you? It was a spirit of hatred. I began to find myself night and day in all my idle moments thinking about this person with whom this conflict was going on, and allowing strange winds of resentment, feelings of real, utter hostility toward this person. It began to affect my personal relationships, even in our family. It affected my view of God. It affected my view of people. But all around me, I could not get this person or this conflict off my mind. If I woke up in the middle of the night, that was the person I was thinking about. My mind played games. How could I get back at him? How could I let him know how much he'd hurt me? How could I somehow humiliate him? Because I was a Christian, you don't punch somebody's lights out, but you can find ways to do it with words, I suppose. And so how could I do that? And for the first time in my life, I really began to experience this tremendous, awesome, sinful power of resentment and hatred toward another human being. I never knew that could happen in ministry. Now, many, many years later, I realize it happens all the time. It's most probable that in a group this large, there are some of you right now who are living with a tremendous, volcanic feeling of resentment and dislike, hostility toward a spouse, toward a team member, toward a church member who's making life awful for you right now. And you'd do anything to get back at that person. Well, I've been there. And I'm glad it happened when I was a very young man, because God had to teach me a second most powerful lesson in character. It was what you do in conflict. One weekend I'd been invited to preach in a church in Midwest America. The church didn't have a pastor. They were looking for someone to fill the pulpit for a weekend and speak to a few of their people on Friday and Saturday. And I won't bore you with the story of how I got invited, but I was on my way to that city on an airplane flying 1,000 miles to this place to speak. And the plane was almost empty, and I was sitting at the back all by myself. And somehow I had enough maturity in me to realize that if I got to that weekend of ministry and I tried to preach to those people with the deep, dark spirit that I had in my own soul, it was going to be a catastrophe for them and for me. And I remember in the back of that airplane crying out to God, what do I do in a moment like this? Literally, the tears were coming down my cheeks. I could talk out loud to God because there was no one around, and the plane's engines were very noisy. And I think I heard the Holy Spirit say something like this: you could try forgiving. You may find this strange, but when you're 25, 26 years of age, and you haven't had enough years under you, it could be that you have never really had an experience in your life yet that requires profound forgiveness. Well, that was true of me. I'd never really had to profoundly forgive a person before. And I'm not sure I understood how it worked. But here was the Holy Spirit saying, you could try forgiveness. And I remember that afternoon on that airplane begging God for the power to forgive, to wipe the mind clean of the offenses, like you might erase a whiteboard. And suddenly, without any expectation of this, it seemed to me, it's the closest I've come to one of those incredible, miraculous experiences that sometimes people describe in books or in talks or on television. But it seemed to me as if God cut a large hole in my chest. And for the next half hour, I just felt all this strange kind of stuff flowing out of me instead of into me. At about the time that the plane's wheels touched the ground in this far-off city, it stopped happening. And when I walked off that plane, men and women, I virtually danced off it. It was as if I'd lost 50 pounds of weight. There was something that replaced the darkness with joy. And I am not kidding you, nor am I exaggerating when I tell you that I went on as a young man to preach that weekend in that church with more power than I have hardly ever experienced before or since in my life. And at the end of the weekend, without any expectation of this happening, the leadership of the church came to me and they said, you know, you're a very young man, but you have something in your spirit we need in this church because we're very divided. And we need someone who can bring us together, and you look to be the kind of person who could do that. And we'd want to know, would you be willing to be a candidate for the pastor of our church? And about 8 or 10 weeks later, Gail and I were installed as pastor and pastor's wife of that congregation, and it became the first significant pastoral ministry we had in our lives together. I've often asked myself, where would we be today? What would my story be like, and what would be the journey that we would have taken if in that key hour on that airplane I had not found the power to forgive? I wonder how many of us in this room will have different stories as the years go by. because we didn't know how to forgive somebody. A father, a mother, a spouse, a close friend who betrayed us, a church member who became a vicious obstacle to our leadership. And we allow a cloud of this kind of stuff to overcome everything we are. And as a result, where there are those great moments in the life of our story when God had us planned to go that way and we end up going this way, how is life different? Because we don't learn that lesson. How to forgive when someone has stood in our way. Well, you wouldn't know my story if I didn't tell you about a third occurrence, which came a few years later, now that we had been in that church for a while. I hope you won't think ill of me if I tell you that the first 2 or 3 years of ministry in that church went pretty well. People used to say, boy, for a young man, you've got a lot of wisdom. You really understand how to do things. And maybe there was truth to that, because having grown up in a pastor's home, I did know how to do a lot of things. I'd learned them as a kid. My father was one of these people who always loved to teach, and if there was nobody there to teach, then he'd grab me and he'd teach me. So I more than once sat on the edge of a deacon's meeting or an elder's meeting and watched how the leadership of a church conducted its business. I would sit sometimes on Sunday and listen to my father preach, and I'd have a copy of his sermon notes on my lap, and I would follow along on how he'd built his sermon and how he delivered it. So I knew how to do that stuff. On occasion, he had taken me with him to make a pastoral call. That seemed to him to be a good father and son deal. And so he would take me to the hospital, and I would stand at his shoulder as he ministered to men and women. One time when I was about 15 years of age, the phone call came to the house. A church member had been rushed to the hospital in an emergency, and my father was gone on a trip, and there was no one to go to the hospital and minister to this person. So without saying anything to anybody, I got on the bus, went to the hospital, sneaked past security, went up, and I said to this man, I've come to call on you. And I read the Bible, the passages I'd seen my father select, and I put my hand on his shoulder and I prayed for him. He was astonished. The word got along with a 15-year-old kid making hospital calls. I could do that kind of stuff. Words came easily to me. You're beginning to see, he can gab on all day long, I suspect, the way he's going. Words came easily. It was not hard for me to think quickly on my feet and come up with answers for people, even if the answers didn't make any sense. People were charmed by the words. That's why when you're 27 or 28, you can do a lot of things in ministry, and people think it's cute. This young guy who can do all this stuff. But then around the age of 31, became a very important day. I had for several weeks been going at a tremendous rate of speed. Up before the sun, in bed late at night, 7 days a week. There'd been some tensions in our leadership that I'd been trying to resolve. I'd been preaching almost every day in one venue or another in some situation, not having enough time to prepare. Been counseling problems. And there were 2 funerals in about 2 weeks' time of where people died tragic deaths, and it had just really crushed my spirit. And I'd had no time for any kind of spiritual activity at all for myself. Nobody called me together into a room like this and said, let's just spend a day talking about us. And on a Saturday morning, I came down to breakfast, and Gail said rather quietly, and she was accurate in what she said, you know, you haven't spent much time with the family lately. And my response to that simple statement, Gail says, you know, you haven't spent much time with the family lately. My response was to start crying. Not just crying, crying, weeping, retching, sobbing. It went on for 4 hours. And I remember thinking at that moment, is this what it's like to lose your mind? I'd never heard of anybody doing that before. And I often smile and say, as a man, it's important for me to tell you I'd never done that before and haven't done it since. But I did it that morning. And Gail, in her wisdom, got the kids off to a neighbor. And she just held me in her arms for those 4 hours and shared that catharsis with me. She didn't preach at me and say, you know, you're a man, men don't do this kind of thing. Or you're a pastor and you ought to have better control of yourself. She just stuck through it with me. Over the years, as I've told that story, I've had more than a few men and women come up to me at the end of a session and say, I've been there. I just didn't know anybody else had been there too. But there do come those moments, men and women, if you're a public person, where it just all explodes on you. And you can't contain the grief or the hurt or the pressure any longer. And it comes out like some of those steam pits we saw down near Taupo in the last couple of days. That afternoon, I remember sitting quietly asking, what does this mean? You see, when you go through moments that are unusual like that, the most important question, my opinion, you can ask yourself, and not enough of us do this, the important question at that moment is, what does this mean? What's the underlying message? Is God operational in this? Is he saying something? Has he allowed you to go through a dark moment like this? What does it mean? For me, the meaning came in these words. It was as if God was saying to me that day, now you know what it's like to reach the point of an empty soul. Now, that's not a theological statement. It's an experiential statement. But I do think more than a few men and women do ministry on an empty soul. It's like when you drove here this morning, your gas tank is on the E, and you just hope you can make it through a few more kilometers and get to this church, but your tank is empty. And you're just not sure how much further you can go. I wonder how many of us this morning have an empty soul. Going through the motions and keeping up the calendar, and you're putting out week after week after week and whatever it is that you're paid to do. But the soul got empty a long time ago. A few years ago, Gail and I were in Moldova, which is part of the old Soviet Union. And the people who were our hosts were about as poor as any group of people we have ever been with. One of the ways I knew it was whenever they drove us from one village to another, every time we came to a hill, when we went down the hill, they would turn off the engine and coast to save another teaspoon of gasoline. That's how empty their tanks were. And that's the way some of us are doing ministry. We're taking every chance we can to coast because we just don't have much in the soul. And that afternoon, I learned the third most important lesson in my life. You can't do a sustainable, lifelong ministry on a soul which is constantly empty. And that's why people start dropping out in their 40s. That's why many ministry marriages go flat. That's why more than a few men and women start just dealing in words but no substance, because they're trying to do it on the basis of an empty soul. Let me tell you two more things about my story. Some years later, God taught me a fourth profound lesson to mark the story of my life. There came a moment in my 40s when, and I'm going to skip a lot of detail here because it's not relevant or useful, when I was asked to consider taking the position of leading a very, very large Christian organization. If I named it, you'd all know the name. It was not a task that neither my wife or I wanted. We weren't seeking it. We feared it. And yet it just seemed to us that God was saying, you've got to say yes to this process. And so we said, yes, I'll be a candidate. And the weeks and weeks went by of all the interviews and all the vetting and all the stuff that goes on in a situation like that. We came down to the last 4 weeks before the decision was to be made. Gail and I went away for our vacation. We secluded ourselves for a long time in quiet. We read book after book. We prayed. We talked. We walked in the woods. We asked the advice and counsel of people we trusted. And take my word for it, every time we came to a conclusion, it seemed to us as if God was saying, this is your next step in the future. This is what's going to happen. We were so sure that we were hearing the will of God. It was as clear to us as anything we'd ever seen before. And then the day of decision came, and I will not forget when the chairman of the board of this organization called me late in the evening, and he said, Gordon, we've picked the other person. I said, thank you very much. It's good news. You picked the right guy. Hung up the phone very nobly, went to bed, slept well, went back to my work for the next week, and then about 10 days later, I suddenly awakened to the significance of this moment, and the only thing I could say is, what in the world has happened here? I was so sure I'd heard God speak. I had applied everything that I'd been preaching for 25 years. And it all had lined up perfectly with almost no bumps in the road. But it was wrong. It was wrong. I cannot describe to you the paralyzing numbness of the disillusionment that surged through me in the next weeks and months. Now I know, at my age, that I'm not alone in this experience either. That more than a few people have been so sure over the years that they too knew how God speaks and directs. And they too experienced a blind spot in a moment when they were wrong too. In fact, I'll be so bold as to say, I doubt if you can go through a lifelong time of ministry without some profound experience of disillusionment, when it seems as if God has just turned his back and stopped speaking in a language you understand. St. John once called it the dark night of the soul. He said there are times when God does seem to turn his back upon people, and everything does become dark. It's one of the supreme ultimate tests that Job goes through. Will you be faithful even though it seems that God wants to slay you? And that was one of my dark nights. And it didn't go away quickly. Now I can look back some 20 years later and say, God really saved me from something. He was really on my side all the way, but at that moment, I could not see that at all. And I really struggled. My bet is that some of you are struggling similarly today. The fifth chapter of my story is the hardest to tell because it may make one or two of you wonder why in the world you're here. But 20 years ago, and again, I don't wish to go into detail, I reached one of the darkest moments of my own personal life and caused one of the darkest moments in the lives of the people around me that I love the most. Because for reasons that are dark and very difficult to explain, in a moment I broke the vows of my marriage. I betrayed the thing that was most precious and faced the shame and the humiliation and the catastrophe of losing everything. And Gail and I had to retreat into seclusion and to step away and to say to the public, it doesn't look like there's a tomorrow. We won't be back unless people invite us back. And we can remember with great vividness the months that followed. Getting up on Sunday mornings knowing that all of our friends were going to their churches to preach the Bible and to pastor their people. We had no place to go. It seemed to me that 25 years of life had been wasted. How could God take a broken person who had so shamed himself and disappointed the people best around him? How could God use a person like that ever again? You're smart enough to know that a lot of people don't come back once those kind of things have happened. if it were not for the grace of some very, very fine people projected toward me, I'd not be here today. Ironically, it seems to me that over the last 20 years, it's been out of the brokenness that Gail and I experienced in those days that God has given to us our deepest insights and has broken perhaps that level of whatever it is, pride or arrogance that may have been very much a part of my life in those days. So when I stand before a group of people like you today, I am reminded constantly that everything I do is the result of grace. Grace is perhaps the most important theme to me of all the biblical themes, because I know personally what grace can do to restore relationships and rebuild life and show us a face of God that we would not have otherwise appreciated, that so often comes out of brokenness. So now you know my story. Now you know a lot of the stuff that you didn't know 45 minutes ago. Now you're wondering, couldn't we have spent this day in a little bit better way? What does this man have to tell us? Well, I can tell you some things that come out of 66 years of life. Out of 5 congregations that have been, every one of them, wonderful experiences for Gail and me. Leadership in a parachurch organization where we came to love people deeply and to experience their love. And when you get an old guy who's willing to tell you his story, then maybe in the rubble of everything he shares with you, there's something worth hearing. So with that preface, let me show you a few things before we break for coffee in exactly 12 minutes. That was, Alan, is it 12 minutes or? Oh, up to me? Never say that to a preacher. Oh, quarter to, okay. As I love to tell people in an exchange like that, once somebody said that, and I went on for 4 hours. And when I, thank you, Alan, for that. When I got through, I said to the people, I have more to say, but Jesus told me to stop, and they stood and sang, "What a friend we have in Jesus." But let's talk for a little while today about the key exposures of men and women in public life. If we were to, if I were to play that game with you that I played a little while ago, give me some words. If I were to now, I'm not going to do this, but if I were to say, what do you think are the key vulnerabilities that confront a man or a woman in Christian leadership over and over and over again in the course of public ministry? What do you think those key exposures would be? I'm going to show you what I think they would be over the next period of time. But I think this is a very, very important question. Ministry begins with a sense of call. It is sustained with opportunities that God opens to us like doors in our lives. But all along the line, there are these moments of exposure. The United States right now is going through this very, very difficult time of war in Iraq. We've watched some of our finest young men and women killed because of something they call IEDs, these improvised explosive devices that sit along the roads and indiscriminately go off when the military vehicles go by, and good people lose their lives, and it just is breaking our hearts. What are the IEDs that men and women in ministry have to think about day after day? Where are the points of exposure? That's the outline for the day. Could I introduce to you for a few minutes an American painter by the name of Norman Rockwell? If you were an American audience, I would say to you, who painted this picture? And everybody would say Norman Rockwell, because in the U.S., he's known as one of the most popular favorite painters of the 20th century. Died about 20 years ago. Most of Rockwell's paintings were originally done as magazine covers for a magazine that was called the Saturday Evening Post. This one was done in 1972. It's entitled The Triple Self-Portrait. And if you study this painting very, very carefully, it is jammed full of messages. For example, those of you who are into art know that down through history, there have been a lot of artists who paint self-portraits of themselves. It saves a lot of money that normally you would have to pay models for. See? But when most artists paint themselves, they don't do what Rockwell has done in this painting. Did it impress you that right at the center of this painting, the artist has turned his back to us? What's the message when someone turns their back to you? Have you ever preached a sermon and noticed that there are people who avoid you as they go out the door? Either you've made them angry, or they don't like what you preached, or they're afraid of saying something they don't want to say, so they turn their back to you. I'm sure virtually every one of us in this room has had someone turn their back on us, and we intuited at that very moment. It was a message of contempt. It was a message of depreciating us. It was a message of hostility. Turning your back on a person can send a lot of messages. It could be, in this particular painting, that what the author's doing right off the top by turning his back to us is he's saying, you know, I'm not going to let you know me that easily. When I got up here, I didn't turn my back to you, and I allowed you to make those first impressions. Now you have a different impression. I'll bet you every one of you has a dramatically different impression of me now than you had an hour ago. Because then all you had was what you see. Now you know something about my heart and my story. And you've made some different decisions about me. Rockwell has turned his back to us. He's going to force us to search to find out who the real Rockwell is. Now, if you look at the upper right-hand quadrant of this painting, to the upper right-hand corner of the canvas, you'll see several small self-portraits that come out of the history of Western art. Van Gogh is there, Michelangelo is there, Rembrandt is there, Albert Dürer is there, Picasso is there. But here's a little American truth or insight. Rockwell always loved to play tricks in his paintings. And the picture of Picasso is not Picasso, but one of his girlfriends. But nobody knows this. No one knows what Picasso is painting anytime anyway, you see. So you're left to your surprises. But look at all those little pieces of self-portraits up there. What are they saying to you and me? Here's the message I get. Rockwell is saying, I want you to know me, first of all, by who my heroes are. This is the company or the community in which I want to travel. These people set the standards by which I want to do my own work. When you think of me, I want you to think of me among them. Now that's an interesting thought. When I meet people for the first time and we have a chance to talk, I often have this fun question I ask them. I'll say, who are your heroes? What do you mean by that? Well, who do you look up to? Who are the people that set the standard by which you want to conduct your life and your work? So, here you are musicians. If we had time to talk, I'd say, who are your heroes? Do you like jazz musicians, country and western? Do you like classical musicians? Do you like indigenous music? Who are your heroes, you say? That's what I would ask musicians. If I was talking to just men and women who make their money preaching, I might say, who are your heroes? Someone would say, Spurgeon. Someone would say, Billy Graham. Someone would say, F.W. Borum, who was a great New England preacher back in the 1920s on the South Island. Who are your heroes? Who do you want to be included with? Who are you trying to live up to? Who sets the standards for your life? That's one of the ways we get to know each other as to what we aspire to be by who we want to be in the company of. But now if you search around this canvas, you will see another interesting thing in this painting. Look to the left side. Here Rockwell has set up an old mirror on a chair, and he's looking at himself. Now, for the first time, we do get some impressions about Rockwell on the surface of his life. Look into that mirror. What do you see? I see an old guy, probably about my age. The skin in his face is sagging. The hair is receding and falling out. The shoulders are stooped. You could almost ski down them. The pipe hangs out of his mouth like a tired jaw. But notice the most interesting thing about the face in the mirror. You can't see his eyes. Either the light is reflecting on the glasses or something has steamed them up. But Rockwell has chosen not to show us his eyes. Wonder why? If you're in ministry, you know that one of the ways we get into a person's soul is through their eyes. It's the eyes that so often tell us what's going on in a person's life in the deeper levels, isn't it? I've often thought this is why celebrities wear sunglasses. In effect, they're saying, you can look at my body if you want, you can be entertained by the things I say, but I'm not letting you into my private space. And they cover their eyes with their sunglasses. You know, in church, if people are having struggles, they're going through guilt, or they feel like you've let them down, or they have hostility to you, most frequently they will avert any connection with you by not looking at you. They'll avoid you. They'll go out the other door from the door you're shaking hands at. They don't want to make eye contact with you. Because it's through the eyes that we learn most about a person. Gail and I go to a restaurant. We look at all the couples around us. You can always tell the people who are falling into love. They sit at the table like this. They look deeply into each other's eyes. They don't break eye contact for a moment. They keep looking and looking as if to say, are you really truthful in what you're saying to me? Can I really trust you? What's going in your heart? And they look at each other's eyes. Then you look at other couples. You know they've been married for 30 years. They don't want to look into each other's souls any longer. They avert eye contact. Rockwell doesn't want you to see his eyes. He's just an old man in that mirror. Now look at the man on the canvas to Rockwell's right. It's the same guy. What do you think is the age difference between the two? The man in the mirror and the man on the canvas? 35 years? See how Rockwell leans toward the mirror as if he can't believe his own eyes? He reminds me of a lot of us men who get up, who are older in years, and we get up and we go into the bathroom in the morning and we look in the mirror and we see the face of our fathers. My gosh, I look just like him. All my life I've been running from him, and now I look, he's right here. He's looking at me in this mirror. And Rockwell looks into that mirror, and it's almost as if he's studying that face and saying, I can't believe what I'm seeing. And he's got his right hand up there trying to interpret what he sees in the mirror through the brush that's about to address the canvas. And something changes from the left to the right. Because the man on the canvas is 35 years younger, but he's Norman Rockwell too. This is the Rockwell on Rockwell's soul. This is the man that Rockwell sees himself to be. Ask a woman or a man how old they are if you dare, and they say, I'm 65, and then follow up with this question, but how old do you feel? And you're more than likely to hear them say, well, I feel 42. We men are like this. We don't think we're ever destructible. We think that we're always young and that everybody sees us as young. I get on a bus. There's a very, very young, lovely-looking woman sitting there, and I smile at her because this is what men do. And she gets up and gives me her seat. I thought I was a young guy, but she sees me as an old grandfather who needs a seat. Look how Rockwell has changed. The face so broad, the eyes so piercing, the pipe saluting in his mouth, the hair, you'd kill for hair like that. The man on the canvas takes charge of things. He's a leader. He's in the height of his vigor and prime of life. So look at the triple self-portrait. Is Rockwell among the heroes? Is he in the mirror? Is he on the canvas? Ladies and gentlemen, this is not an art lesson. This is a very important principle that must be understood as we walk through life as public people. We must know who we are. We must take the time to reflect upon where we've come from. What's our story? Where are we now? What's our status? Where are we going to be? Where's God leading? And if you cannot answer those questions, you are likely to go off course. The kind of men and women who exude the right kind of confidence that causes people to want to follow them are people who are able to manage these questions. Where have I come from? Where am I? Where am I going? Have you ever pondered the significance of the words in John chapter 13 when Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples? And I'm paraphrasing here. It says something like this: Jesus, knowing that the Father had placed all things in his hands, that he knew where he had come from and he knew where he was going, took a basin and a towel and stripped off his outer clothing and began to wash the disciples' feet. How could he do that? Only because at the core of his soul there was a certitude, there was a confidence of who he was. He could wash feet and take the position of a slave with confidence without demeaning himself or feeling something cheaper about himself, because he knew the answer to those three questions. Where have I come from? Where am I? And where am I going? Leaders have to deal with those questions. And that's Rockwell, dealing with questions similar to that in his own experience. Now, let's get off the art lesson and start wrapping this up so we can have some coffee together. If you think this is just my opinion, watch Paul trying to say much the same thing to Timothy in 1 Timothy 4. The two letters to Timothy are really letters from a strong mentor to a young disciple. And the mentor is very worried about the disciple. Apparently, he's left Timothy in Ephesus, where Paul had spent a couple of years. So Paul knows the situation well. He knows that it's a tough church, a tough market, if you please, a little bit like New Zealand. And he's worried about Timothy's ability to sustain. He knows too much about Timothy's temperament, that Timothy is easily intimidated, that he backs off when he shouldn't, that when he gets into the presence of older men, he's likely to become more like jelly than anything. He apparently doesn't know how to call people deeply to account in their Christian growth and their discipleship. And so those two letters are really little more than a coach telling the teammate to buck up and get stronger. Now look at these words. Timothy, set an example. If you read William Barclay, which preachers never like to admit that they read, Barclay does such a wonderful job of telling us how Greek words work in their cultural settings. And Barclay tells us that the word example comes from the Greek word tupos, which means to stamp yourself upon people, as the emperor stamped his face on the face of a coin. Set an example. Stamp yourself upon people. How would you do this, Timothy? Well, let me give you some categories. Set an example in the way you talk and speech. Timothy, every word that comes out of your mouth must be a word of appropriate strength. It must be language that builds, that reflects the Spirit of Jesus. It's language, it's speech, it's words that people will want to hear. Surely every one of us in this room can think of someone in our lives, today or yesterday, that when they speak, everybody wants to hear the quality of the words that come from their mouths, and they judge it to be wisdom and depth and experience. Years ago, we have an American finance company called E.F. Hutton. I don't know whether they advertise in other parts of the world, but they used to have a wonderful advertising campaign for television. And it would start with a whole room of noisy people. And then suddenly in one of the conversations, someone would say, well, my banker is E.F. Hutton, and he says, and suddenly the whole room turns to silence to overhear what E.F. Hutton, the banker, has to say. That's what Paul's saying right here. Timothy, set an example so that every time you open your mouth, people become silent because what you say is worth hearing. Timothy, set an example in the way you live your life. The practicalities of your daily involvement with simple living. The way you make your choices, the way you react in the rotary when someone cuts you off like a dumb American who doesn't know to look to the right. Set an example in the way you keep your home or your apartment or your condominium or whatever it is. Set an example in the way you carry on your financial life. In life, Timothy, understand that the difference will be made as people see the way you're living in the everyday nuances of existence. Set an example, Timothy, in love, in the way you carry on your intimate relationships, the way you treat members of the opposite sex, the way you carry on friendships, the way you treat the men and women who work in the congregation, the way you treat your neighbors, the way you treat the waiter or the waitress at the restaurant. In all human interactions, set an example through the ethic, the politic of Christian love. Timothy, set an example in faith. Let people see daily the way you walk with God. Let them see the evidence that God speaks into your heart and you're obedient, that you are not afraid to bring anything into the presence of God and that He hears, that you believe God and His promises, that you walk in His directions, that you are a man growing day by day in your faith. Is there any better compliment to be received when you're a Christian leader than someone who says, you know, Pastor, we just love to watch you week after week growing before our very eyes. Set an example in faith. Timothy, set an example in purity. I can only assume this means Timothy's moral life, the kind of entertainment that he immerses his mind on day after day in purity. The way you make things work. Now notice the stress that Timothy hears in Paul's words in the next verses. Be diligent in these matters. Diligent means I'm bold-facing, I'm underlining these things, Timothy. Don't take this stuff for granted. Give yourself wholly to them so that everyone will see the way you're growing. This sentence justifies what I think is the purpose of this whole day. Watch your life and your doctrine closely. The point being that part of your job and my job is to regularly, rhythmically reflect upon myself and what God is trying to say into my life. This whole business of watching my life and doctrine is not something I do after the work is done, because the work is never done. It is part of the work. If you decide that your job calls for you to invest, let me give you a wild number, 70 hours of work a week toward the organization that employs you, then I want to tell you, part of those 70 hours are watching your life and your doctrine. Life, the way you live, doctrine, the things you believe. And if these watches are not on your calendar, then you and I invite trouble. Persevere in them. Look at all these action words. Be diligent, give yourself wholly, watch, persevere, because if you do this, you will both save yourself and your hearers. How can it be any plainer? And yet, unfortunately, in our modern church world, we are so inundated with challenges to become a part of this campaign and that conference and this program and these actions that when it's all over, there is no room, no time to do what this paragraph has to say. That's why when I ask the question, what would you say is the state of the morale of Christian leadership in New Zealand? One or two of you come up with very positive, enthusiastic words. But the majority of you who spoke come up with words like exhausted, timid, struggling. And I can only assume that you have the same problem here that we have back where I live. That is, few people believe this paragraph. So when we come back together again after our break, let's pull this paragraph apart and ask ourselves, what does it mean to watch your life and your doctrine closely? What are some of the things that are necessary? And maybe we can come up with some handles on how to make this work. So I'll see you at 11:15.